The endless expanse of space beyond Corvus Prime shimmered like liquid on the edge of a blade, distant stars reflecting the quiet stillness before inevitable chaos. Captain Elias Rain leaned against the observation deck's transparent wall, his gray eyes fixed on the teeming corridors below. The alien delegates strode purposefully, their footsteps ringing against the polished obsidian floors, each stride carrying the weight of millennia of dominance. Elias adjusted the collar of his regulation coat, the fabric rough and unyielding against his neck. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the pain in a fleeting reminder of the human fragility these beings so eagerly dismissed. In the reflection, he caught the glimmer of his commander's insignia, a gilded falcon clutching a broken chain, a symbol of Earth's hope, fragile but defiant. "Captain Rain, you're expected at the council chamber." Lieutenant Asher Michael's measured tone interrupted his thoughts. The young officer, always sharp in both uniform and composure, stood at attention, his auburn hair catching the artificial lighting above. Elias turned, his words deliberate. "Expected or tolerated, Michael?" "Both, sir, for now." A flicker of dry humor danced at the corner of Michael's lips, but his eyes betrayed his unease. The air inside the station carried a sterile chill, imbued with faint hints of metallic preservation. As Elias made his way down the marble-lined corridors, the hollow thud of his boots mingled with distant snippets of alien languages, clicking, droning, and harmonized tones that sounded more calculated than conversational. "Do you feel it?" Michael asked quietly, walking beside him, the weight of his question dropping like lead. "What?" "The anticipation, the arrogance of these beings, like we're a bad joke they're forced to endure." Elias didn't respond. Instead, his gaze flicked to a trio of Kulrith delegates at the far end of the hall. Their towering frames, draped in flowing crimson robes, radiated the kind of contempt only born from centuries of unchallenged power. One turned its elongated head toward Elias, the bioluminescent rings across its neck pulsing faintly, a clear sign of disdain. Elias offered a curt nod before stepping into the council chamber. The room expanded in every direction, an amphitheater of authority designed to overwhelm. Suspended above the circular table, holograms of distant star systems flickered, their light casting sharp shadows across the faces of the assembled leaders. At the far side, Supreme Arbiter Kael Dran of the Galactic Concordance stood. His crystalline form refracted light into shards of color, making him appear as if he were carved from the stars themselves. His voice was a low resonance, layered with an almost musical quality. "Let us begin. The matter of humanity's grievances has been tabled. Again." Elias stepped forward, aware of every eye now fixed on him. He wasn't a politician, but he'd learned to mask his discomfort beneath a veneer of calm authority. "Grievances. That's one word for it," Elias began, his tone carrying just enough edge to cut. "Systematic resource embargoes, covert sabotage of our trade routes, unprovoked strikes on human vessels. If we were the ones committing these acts, I doubt they'd be labeled grievances." A ripple of movement shifted through the delegates. The Kulrith emissary, Reshitarek, leaned forward, his clawed hands gripping the edge of the table. His mandibles clicked sharply. "Your kind mistakes growth for entitlement, Captain. Your cries for fairness grow tedious. The galaxy has no obligation to accommodate those who refuse to earn their place." Elias's knuckles whitened against the smooth surface of the podium. "Refuse to earn? Every step we've taken beyond our system has been through blood, innovation, and sacrifice. We've earned our place tenfold. You're just unwilling to see it because it challenges the monopoly you've maintained for eons." Kael Dran raised a hand, his crystalline fingers catching the light. "Captain Rain, emotions serve no purpose here. This is a forum of logic and governance, not a platform for outbursts." "Then let me appeal to logic." Elias straightened, his voice sharper now. "Humanity has adhered to every treaty, honored every diplomatic protocol. Yet we're punished for the mere act of existing. If you push any species to the edge long enough, they will push back." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the soft vibration of atmospheric stabilizers overhead. It was Liana Drell, seated in the human delegation, who spoke next. Her pale blue skin shimmered faintly under the holographic glow, her voice as smooth as flowing water. The Concordance thrives on the illusion of unity. But it is an illusion, Captain. The question is not whether they'll see humanity's worth. The question is how much they're willing to lose before they acknowledge it. Elias glanced at her, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Enough, Reshitarik growled. We waste time on a species that will break itself long before it breaks us. This meeting is over. The Kolrith delegates rose as one, their movement swift and deliberate. Other species followed, some with indifference, others with veiled unease. As the chamber emptied, Mikkel whispered, "That went well." Elias didn't answer. His focus was on the Kolrith delegation, their strides filled with an unmistakable purpose. Something felt wrong, a tension that went beyond the usual disdain. It wasn't until hours later, back aboard the Horizon's Aegis, that the pieces began to fall into place. Elias stood in the dim glow of the ship's tactical console, the faint hum of data streams punctuating the silence. Michael approached, a datapad in hand. "Transmission intercepted from the Kolrith fleet," Michael said, his words heavy. "They're mobilizing. Target appears to be the Eridan trade colony." Elias's breath stilled. The colony housed over 200,000 civilians, mostly families. "They're going to burn it," Michael continued, his voice dropping. For a moment, Elias stared at the console, the star map glowing coldly beneath his hands. He felt the weight of two futures pressing against him, one where he acted and risked everything, and one where inaction would etch his failure into the stars. "Prepare the fleet," he said finally, his voice steady. "We intercept them before they reach Eridan." "Sir, without official sanction?" "To hell with sanction, Lieutenant. If the Council won't protect our people, we will." As Michael left to carry out the order, Elias remained, his eyes fixed on the distant points of light. Somewhere out there, Reshitarik's fleet was bearing down on the colony like a storm on the horizon. And as Elias clenched his fists, he thought not of glory, not of victory, but of every life he would save, or fail to save. The moment felt like the weight of an entire world resting on his shoulders. The command bridge of the Horizon's Aegis was a hive of controlled chaos. Officers moved briskly, their boots whispering over the reinforced steel decking. Screens flickered with streams of intercepted Kolrith communications, their harsh alien symbols flashing like malevolent warnings. The air inside the ship was taut, thickened by the shared anticipation of conflict. Elias Rain stood at the center, a solitary figure bracing against the coming storm. The tactical display cast a cold, bluish glow across his angular face, highlighting the faint lines that years of decisions, some hard, others harder, had etched there. He stared at the holographic map, where glowing red markers, representing Kolrith warships, closed in on the Eridan colony. "How many ships in the convoy?" Elias asked, his voice low but with a sharpness that cut through the tension. "5 destroyers, 2 carriers," replied Lieutenant Michael, not looking up from his console. His fingers danced over the controls, feeding data into the ship's predictive models. Their formations suggest an intent to overwhelm, not negotiate. "They won't need to negotiate if we're too late," Elias muttered. He turned to Specialist Liana Drell, who stood at the periphery of the room. Her pale blue complexion shimmered faintly under the display's light, an unearthly calm radiating from her despite the urgency of the situation. "Options?" Elias demanded. Liana stepped forward, her soft-footed grace barely audible against the bridge's muted activity. She held a datapad close to her chest, her silver eyes sharp and calculating. "The Kolrith's primary comms rely on a phased array system. Disrupt it, and they'll be blind for long enough to force a retreat or neutralize them entirely." "And the risk?" Elias pressed. "They'll know it's us," Liana said simply. Her words carried a gravity that silenced the murmurs of the surrounding crew. "We're past worrying about optics," Elias said, his tone colder now. "Prepare the interference protocols." A sudden proximity alert flared to life, casting a fiery red hue across the bridge. Michael's hands froze over his console. "Sir," he said, his voice strained, "we've got Colrith scouts on long-range sensors. They'll intercept us before we reach Eridan." Elias's jaw tightened. "How long?" 2 hours? Maybe less." The captain's mind raced, weighing options that felt like trying to navigate a minefield blindfolded. To engage early meant exposing their ship to unnecessary risk, but delaying could doom the colony. Elias finally turned to Mikkel. "Bring the main batteries online. If they want to test us, let them." The young lieutenant hesitated, his brow furrowed, before nodding and relaying the order. Liana tilted her head slightly, studying Elias with an intensity that felt invasive. "You're calculating something," she said softly. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to the display, the glowing markers like tiny, malevolent stars mocking his every move. "My job is to stay 3 steps ahead," he replied after a moment. "And right now, I need them to believe we're predictable." The moment of contact was sudden and absolute. Space, with all its vast, silent beauty, erupted into violent light as the Colrith scouts emerged from the void. Their sleek black hulls glinted like predators' teeth as they launched the first salvo, a volley of charged plasma bolts that streaked toward the horizon's aegis. Elias stood anchored at the bridge, the vibrations from the ship's energy shields absorbing the impact, reverberating faintly through the deck. He didn't flinch as the display updated, the plasma dispersing into harmless fragments against their defenses. "Return fire," he ordered, his voice cutting through the bridge's tension like a blade. The ship's cannons roared silently into the vacuum of space. Streams of concentrated kinetic rounds streaked toward the Colrith vessels, tearing through one scout ship's forward hull with surgical precision. The explosion was brief and bright, a star born and snuffed out in an instant. "First target neutralized," Michael reported, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Target the second," Elias said. The Colrith ships moved erratically now, their pilots scrambling to evade the human counteroffensive. It wasn't enough. The second scout ship disintegrated moments later, leaving only a ghostly cloud of debris in its wake. "Remaining scouts are retreating," Liana noted, her tone detached but her posture tense. Elias exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing only slightly. "Don't celebrate yet. That was just their bait." As if on cue, a larger blip appeared on the sensors, a Colrith destroyer, its jagged silhouette unmistakable. "Incoming transmission," Michael announced. "Patch it through," Elias said, his voice a steady anchor. The bridge filled with the guttural tones of Colrith speech, their words harsh and clipped, like the snapping of metal. A translation appeared on screen, the words cutting through any pretense of diplomacy. "Surrender your vessel, or we will reduce it to atoms." Elias stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant Michael," he said evenly, "prepare the decoy signal. Let's see how they handle a little misdirection." Michael's hands moved quickly, the faint click of keys punctuating the heavy silence. "Signal ready, sir. Execute." Moments later, a holographic signature identical to the Horizon's aegis appeared on the destroyer's sensors, positioned several thousand clicks away. The Colrith vessel hesitated, their attention split between the two targets. "Now!" Elias ordered, his voice sharp. The Horizon's aegis unleashed its full arsenal, a barrage of kinetic rounds and precision missiles aimed directly at the destroyer's engines. The impact was immediate, the vessel lurching violently as its propulsion systems failed. "Disable their weapons and comms," Elias added. "I want them dead in the water." Within moments, the Colrith destroyer was effectively neutralized, its once formidable presence reduced to a drifting wreck. "Status of Eridan colony?" Elias asked. "Still under threat, but we've bought ourselves time," Liana replied. Elias nodded, though his mind remained on edge. Each victory felt like a stepping stone across a bottomless chasm, with no certainty of what lay on the other side. Hours later, the Horizon's aegis continued its approach to Eridan, the tension aboard the ship settling into a restless quiet. In the dimly lit tactical room, Elias stood alone, reviewing intercepted transmissions from the Kolrith fleet. Liana entered silently, her presence unannounced but not unwelcome. "You're thinking too far ahead," she said, her voice soft but firm. Elias glanced at her, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's the only way to think in a fight like this." She crossed her arms, her silver eyes studying him. "The Kolrith are testing your resolve. They expect retaliation. What they won't expect is escalation." Elias turned back to the screen, her words weighing heavily. "Escalation's a dangerous game," he said. Liana stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's the only game they'll respect." The two stood in silence, the faint hum of the ship's systems a reminder of the battle yet to come. For Elias, the stakes were no longer just about the colony. They were about proving that humanity was more than a fleeting spark in the galaxy's darkness. It was a fire waiting to consume. The Horizon's aegis approached the Eridan colony with calculated precision, its silhouette a blade slicing through the fabric of deep space. The stars beyond were no longer pinpricks of light, but silent witnesses to the chaos that would soon unfold. Elias Rain stood at the helm, his gaze fixed on the tactical map hovering in midair. Red blips representing Kolrith destroyers loomed ominously close to the fragile green marker of the colony. "Status report," Elias demanded, his tone sharp enough to make the bridge crew snap to attention. Lieutenant Michael's fingers skimmed the controls. "The colony's orbital defenses are holding, but barely. Civilian evacuation is at 62%. They'll never get everyone out in time." Elias clenched his jaw, his hand curling around the cold steel railing. The colony wasn't just a settlement. It was a lifeline, a testament to humanity's grit in carving existence from the void. The thought of it, reduced to rubble, churned in his gut like acid. Liana Drell stood at his shoulder, her alien features impassive but her voice calm and deliberate. "The Kolrith won't waste time posturing. Their next wave will target critical infrastructure, atmospheric regulators, energy hubs, and command centers." Elias turned to her, his expression as unyielding as stone. "Then we don't give them the chance. Have the fleet split into 3 units. We'll use their arrogance against them." Liana raised a slender brow. "You're baiting them?" "Exactly." Elias's eyes darkened. "They'll chase what they think is weakness. Meanwhile, we'll gut their core formation before they even realize it's a trap." The bridge lights dimmed as the ship's combat systems powered up. The faint thrum of energy coursing through the vessel created an almost imperceptible vibration underfoot, like the heartbeat of a giant. Across the viewport, distant flashes of light punctuated the void, brilliant bursts of plasma, the last, desperate stand of the colony's defense grid. "Transmit the orders," Elias commanded. The fleet broke formation, scattering like shards of glass. Smaller frigates darted ahead, their hulls painted in matte black to absorb enemy sensors. The Horizon's aegis, a spearhead among the chaos, surged forward. The Kolrith destroyers were relentless, their weapons discharged in synchronized bursts, streaks of molten blue tearing through the darkness. The impact against the human shields sent shock waves reverberating through the hull. "Brace for impact," Michael shouted, gripping the edge of his console. The deck shuddered beneath their feet, and a shower of sparks cascaded from an overloaded panel. Elias's voice cut through the alarms like a whip. "Target their lead destroyer, disable their maneuvering thrusters, cripple them, but keep them alive long enough to panic." The ship's main cannon roared, its energy discharge a searing lance that pierced the Kolrith destroyer's side. A section of its hull crumpled inward, spilling debris into the void. "Direct hit," Michael confirmed, sweat beading along his temple. "Their formation's destabilizing." Elias leaned closer to the tactical map. "Good. Push the advantage. Send the frigates to sweep their flanks. Force them inward." The smaller human ships surged into action, weaving through enemy fire with nimble grace. They attacked the destroyers' blind spots, targeting weak points with ruthless efficiency. The Kolrith vessels, so confident in their superior firepower, now found themselves herded into a deadly bottleneck. A sharp intake of breath came from Liana. "Their carrier is moving. Elias' eyes snapped to the tactical map. The Colrith carrier, a massive monstrosity bristling with weapons, was breaking from the rear to engage directly. It was a desperate move, and desperation made even the strongest enemies dangerous. "Focus fire on their weapons array," Elias ordered. "We can't let them deploy reinforcements." The Horizon's Aegis unleashed another volley, its missiles streaking toward the carrier like silent comets. The explosions rippled across the enemy ship's surface, but its thick armor absorbed most of the damage. "They're launching interceptors," Michael warned. From the carrier's underbelly, a swarm of sleek, predatory ships erupted like a nest of hornets. They closed the distance with terrifying speed, their plasma cannons cutting fiery trails through the darkness. "Deploy countermeasures," Elias barked. The Horizon's Aegis released a cluster of decoy drones, each emitting false energy signatures. The interceptors veered off course, chasing the illusions, only to be picked off by precision fire from the frigates. But the carrier was still advancing, its massive shadow swallowing the stars behind it. "They're powering up their main weapon," Liana said, her voice tight. Elias's mind raced. The carrier's main cannon could obliterate the colony with a single shot. They needed to stop it. Now. "Bring us closer," he ordered. Michael's head snapped up. "Closer? Sir? Their weapon will—" "Closer!" Elias repeated, his tone brooking no argument. "We can't fight them from a distance, not with those shields. Get us within striking range." The Horizon's Aegis surged forward, its engines roaring as it closed the gap. The carrier loomed larger with every passing second, its hull a maze of jagged armor and glowing power conduits. "Target their reactor," Elias said. "A direct hit will overload their systems. We'll take the shot ourselves." Liana's eyes narrowed. "And if we miss?" "We won't," Elias replied, his voice a blade honed to deadly sharpness. The ship's main cannon charged, the energy buildup casting an eerie glow across the bridge. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity, as the targeting systems locked onto the carrier's vulnerable core. "Firing solution ready," Michael said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. "Fire!" Elias commanded. The cannon discharged, a searing beam of light that split the void. It struck the carrier's reactor, punching through its shields like paper. For a moment, there was silence, an unnatural stillness as the energy rippled outward. Then the explosion came. It bloomed like a supernova, a brilliant cascade of fire and debris that consumed the carrier in an instant. The shockwave rippled through space, rattling the Horizon's Aegis as it turned to shield the colony from the blast. When the light faded, the carrier was gone, replaced by a smoldering cloud of wreckage. The remaining Colrith ships hesitated, their formation breaking apart as fear took hold. "They're retreating," Liana said, her voice low. Elias sank back into his seat, his body heavy with exhaustion. The adrenaline coursing through his veins had kept him sharp, but now it left behind a hollow ache. "Signal the colony," he said quietly. "Let them know they're safe. For now." Liana tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "For now," she repeated, her tone carrying a weight that made Elias meet her gaze. "We've won a battle," Elias said, his voice grim. "Not the war. And they'll be back with more than just destroyers next time." The bridge fell silent, save for the subtle hum of the ship's systems. Outside, the debris of the battle drifted in quiet testimony to the cost of survival. Elias turned his gaze back to the stars, their cold light promising no solace. In his mind, the next battle had already begun, and somewhere in the void, the Colrith were surely thinking the same. The silence after the battle was its own weight, pressing against the crew of the Horizon's Aegis as they drifted through the debris field. Twisted shards of Colrith steel floated among the stars, the remnants of a desperate skirmish. The smell of charred electronics lingered faintly in the bridge, a reminder of the damage they had narrowly contained. Elias Rain stood motionless, his eyes tracing the outlines of the drifting wreckage on the view screen. "Captain, the colony reports all clear," Lieutenant Michael said from his station, his voice steady but strained. "Evacuation completed. No casualties reported planetside." Elias didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze lingered on the tactical map, now devoid of hostile red markers. Relief wasn't what coursed through him, only a gnawing sense of unfinished business. The Colrith had retreated, but their absence felt calculated, not defeated. Lyanna Drell's voice broke the stillness. "You know this isn't over." Her words were a quiet accusation, as if she were reading his thoughts. He turned to her, catching the faint luminescence of her silver eyes in the dim bridge light. "They don't retreat unless they're regrouping. What are they planning, Lyanna?" Her expression shifted subtly, the faintest trace of unease flickering across her face. "They'll strike where you're weakest. They'll make it hurt." Elias's gaze hardened. "Then we don't wait for them to choose the battlefield." The tension in the room thickened as Elias moved to the command console, his fingers gliding over the controls to pull up the latest intercepts from the Colrith's fragmented communications. Broken phrases and static-laden transmissions scrolled across the screen, but one fragment caught his attention, a reference to Nebula Aeroxis. Lyanna stiffened at the mention of the name, her breath catching audibly. "That can't be right." "What is it?" Elias asked, his tone sharp. "Aeroxis isn't just a nebula," she said slowly, her voice laced with apprehension. "It's an interdiction zone. Nothing survives there, not ships, not probes. It's where the Concordance buries secrets they don't want anyone to find." Elias leaned closer. "What kind of secrets?" Lyanna hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her datapad. "Weapons, experimental technology, and things even they can't control. The fact that the Colrith are going there means they're either desperate or they've found something worth the risk." Elias straightened, his expression unreadable. "Then we're going after them." The bridge crew exchanged uneasy glances. Michael finally spoke, his voice careful. "Captain, we barely survived this engagement. We're not in any shape to go charging into uncharted space, especially not into something like that." Elias fixed him with a level stare. "We don't have a choice, Lieutenant. If the Colrith come back with whatever they're looking for, we won't survive the next engagement. Colony or no colony." Michael opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when Lyanna stepped forward. "He's right," she said quietly. "If the Colrith find what I think they're looking for, it won't just be humanity they're targeting. It'll be the entire balance of the galaxy." Elias's voice cut through the rising tension. "Plot a course for Aeroxis. Maximum speed." The Horizon's aegis surged forward, leaving the safety of the colony behind. As they moved deeper into uncharted space, the stars grew sparse, the blackness outside the viewport becoming a thick, oppressive void. The crew worked in near silence, each of them acutely aware of the risks ahead. The first sign of the nebula came hours later, a faint shimmer on the edge of the sensors. It wasn't like anything they'd encountered before. The Aeroxis nebula writhed, its tendrils of luminous gas twisting like a living thing. It was beautiful in its chaos, but there was something unsettling about the way it seemed to pulse, as though it had a heartbeat. "Entering the outer edge of the nebula," Michael reported, his voice tight. "Sensors are degrading. Communications might follow." Elias nodded. "Keep the systems on manual override. We don't need fancy tech where we're going, just sharp eyes and steady hands." As the ship pushed deeper, the nebula's light seeped into the Horizon's aegis, casting ghostly hues of blue and green across the bulkheads. The vibrations beneath their feet shifted, as though the ship itself were straining against an invisible force. Elias felt it too, a low, almost imperceptible pressure building behind his eyes, like the weight of a storm waiting to break. "Captain, we're picking up something," Lyanna said suddenly. She leaned over the sensor console, her fingers flying across the controls. "Energy signatures, multiple and irregular." "Colrith ships?" Elias asked. "Maybe," she replied, her brow furrowing. "But there's something else. These readings don't match anything we've seen before." Before Elias could respond, a tremor shook the ship, jolting the crew from their seats. Warning lights flared, and the bridge erupted in a cacophony of alarms. "Report!" Elias barked. Michael's voice was strained. Spatial distortions pulling at the ship. It's the nebula. Compensate, Elias ordered. Keep us steady. The view outside the viewport had changed. The nebula's tendrils were no longer distant. They were everywhere, wrapping around the ship like living vines. Light bent and twisted unnaturally, creating illusions that made the bridge crew's stomachs churn. Shadows danced where there should have been none, and the temperature seemed to shift unpredictably, alternating between oppressive heat and bone-deep cold. Then, without warning, the sensors lit up. "Contact!" Liana shouted. "Multiple signatures, closing fast." Elias's heart raced as he turned to the tactical display. Blips surrounded the ship, closing in with predatory intent. "Kolrith?" he asked. "Unclear," Liana replied. "But whatever they are, they're not friendly." The ship shuddered violently as something struck the hull, the impact sending sparks flying across the bridge. Outside, shadowy forms moved within the nebula, their shapes distorted and unnatural. They darted in and out of view, too fast to track, their movements accompanied by faint flashes of eerie blue light. "They're testing us," Elias said, his voice grim. "Weapons online. Fire at anything that gets close." The Horizon's Aegis fought back, its cannons lighting up the nebula with bursts of energy. Explosions flared briefly in the void, but the enemy, whatever it was, kept coming. They moved like ghosts, their forms seeming to flicker in and out of reality. "We can't keep this up," Michael said, his voice tinged with panic. "They're everywhere." Elias's mind raced. This wasn't a battle they could win through brute force. They needed an edge, a way to turn the chaos of the nebula against their enemies. "Liana," he said, his voice sharp, "is there any way to use the distortions to our advantage?" She hesitated, her silver eyes scanning the data streaming across her console. "Maybe. If we overload the energy field around the ship, it could cause a feedback loop in the nebula. But it's a gamble. The ship might not survive it." Elias didn't hesitate. "Do it." The bridge crew sprang into action, the tension in the air crackling like static. As the energy buildup reached critical levels, Elias braced himself, his knuckles white against the console. "Now!" he shouted. The ship released the energy in a blinding pulse, the nebula around them convulsing violently in response. The shadowy forms vanished, consumed by the chaotic light, and the Horizon's Aegis was flung clear of the distortions, tumbling into the calm void beyond. As the crew caught their breath, Liana turned to Elias, her expression grave. "This wasn't just a Kolrith trap. There's something in this nebula, something they were looking for." Elias met her gaze, his voice cold. "Then we need to find it first." The Horizon's Aegis drifted in eerie silence as the nebula's chaotic glow faded into a hollow void. The remnants of energy from their desperate maneuver crackled faintly along the hull, leaving a metallic tang in the recycled air. The crew moved with hushed urgency, as if even the slightest noise might summon whatever predators lurked within the Aeroxus nebula. Elias Rain stood near the central console, his eyes scanning the fragmented data Liana Drell had managed to salvage from the ship's failing sensors. A faint sheen of sweat lined his brow, but his expression remained composed, his every motion deliberate. To the crew, he was a constant, a figure who carried the unbearable weight of command without bending. Inside, however, the storm raged. "What did we just survive?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he looked up from his station. The lines around his eyes deepened, shadows playing tricks on his young face. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he focused on the encrypted Kolrith transmission that flickered on the screen, the alien symbols distorting as the nebula's interference pulsed faintly in the distance. Liana leaned over her station, her elegant fingers moving deftly across the interface. "Captain," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something that resembled doubt. "This isn't random. The Kolrith didn't come here for salvage or data. They were chasing something. These coordinates—" Her voice trailed off, but the implication hung heavily in the room. Elias crossed the bridge in measured strides, his boots tapping softly against the reinforced flooring. "Spit it out, Drell. What's here?" She straightened, meeting his gaze with an intensity that mirrored his own. "Something ancient, and something powerful. This data suggests they're headed for a singularity, an artificial one. A murmur spread through the bridge. Artificial singularities were the stuff of whispers in the galaxy, relics of civilizations long dead, with powers so immense they bordered on myth. Michael broke the silence. Are you saying they've found a weapon? One of those weapons? It's possible, Liana replied. Or worse, something they believe is a weapon. The Concordance always buries what it can't understand. Aeroxus wasn't just a dumping ground. It was a vault. Elias turned his gaze toward the view screen, where the nebula seemed to writhe with malevolent intent. If the Kolrith unleash whatever's in there, it's not just the colonies at risk. It's everything. He paused, weighing his next words like a blade in his hand. We're going in after them. Michael shot up from his seat. Sir, with all due respect. No objections, Elias cut him off, his voice like iron. We didn't come this far to back off now. Prepare the ship for deep field entry and secure all external comms. The young lieutenant hesitated, his shoulders tense, but he nodded and moved to relay the order. As the ship descended deeper into the nebula, the distortions grew more pronounced. Lights flickered sporadically, and faint tremors rippled through the hull, as though the Aegis itself could feel the malevolent force they pursued. Every surface seemed to hum with tension, the weight of the unknown pressing against the crew like an invisible hand. Liana, Elias said, breaking the oppressive silence. How long until we intercept their fleet? Not long, she answered, her tone clipped. But something doesn't add up. If the Kolrith wanted to weaponize this, they'd have moved slower, more carefully. This feels rushed. They're desperate, Elias replied, his mind turning over the possibilities like pieces of a puzzle. But desperate for what? He didn't have to wait long for the answer. As they neared the singularity's coordinates, a sudden burst of energy swept through the nebula, rattling the ship like a tidal wave. The bridge erupted into chaos as warning lights bathed the room in a pulsing red glow. Massive power surge detected, Michael shouted. It's coming from the singularity. Shields up, Elias barked. Hold formation. The Aegis groaned under the strain as the energy wave slammed into it, sparks flying from overloaded circuits. The sound of creaking metal filled the air, and the faint smell of burning insulation prickled the crew's senses. Elias gripped the railing as the ship steadied, his eyes locked on the tactical map. They've activated something, Liana said, her voice filled with urgency. The singularity, it's destabilizing. If it collapses, then we'll be the first to know. Elias finished grimly. What's their fleet's position? They're clustered near the event horizon, she replied. But wait. Her fingers froze over the console. Something's wrong. These readings. They're too clean. What do you mean? Elias demanded. This isn't the Kolrith, she said, her voice lowering. They're the bait. Before Elias could respond, the ship's comm system crackled to life, and a voice he hadn't heard in years filled the bridge. Elias Rain, always the hero, aren't you? The room went still. Elias's chest tightened as the voice settled over him like a shroud. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. Vren Malak, he said, the name tasting like ash. Didn't think I'd see your face again. The screen lit up, revealing the sharp, angular features of Vren, his former comrade and the ghost Elias had buried deep in his past. His dark eyes gleamed with something between amusement and contempt, his lips curling into a predator's smile. You're chasing ghosts, old friend, Vren said. Always were good at that. What are you doing here, Malak? Elias asked, his tone cold enough to freeze a star. Finishing what you never could, Vren replied. You always wanted to save the galaxy, Elias. I just want to remake it. Elias's hand tightened into a fist. You're working with the Kolrith. No, Vren said, his voice dripping with disdain. I'm using them. Same way they've used every species they've conquered, but you wouldn't understand. You're still playing by rules that were never written for us. Whatever you think you're doing, Elias said, his voice like tempered steel, it ends here. Vren laughed, the sound sharp and hollow. You're too late. The singularity isn't a weapon, Elias. It's a gateway. And when it opens, the galaxy will finally know what lies beyond. The screen flickered off before Elias could respond, leaving the bridge in heavy silence. The crew turned to their captain, their faces pale and uncertain. Elias straightened, his voice cutting through the weight of the moment. "We intercept him. Whatever he's planning, we stop it." Liana spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "If Vren's telling the truth, this isn't just a battle. It's a reckoning." Elias nodded, his eyes burning with resolve. "Then we make damn sure we're ready." The horizon's aegis surged forward, its path illuminated by the twisted light of the singularity. Somewhere ahead, Vren and his forces waited, and beyond them lay the unknown, an abyss that promised either salvation or destruction. As the ship pressed on, Elias felt the weight of every choice he'd made and every life that now depended on him. And in the silence of the void, the battle for the galaxy began to take shape. The horizon's aegis cut through the veiled chaos of the nebula, its hull glinting faintly as it neared the singularity's event horizon. The space around the ship seemed alive, pulsating with unpredictable waves of energy that bent light and warped reality. Elias Rain stood rooted at the bridge, his hands gripping the railing as if anchoring himself against the abyss outside. "Captain, we're nearing their fleet," Liana Drell said, her tone carrying an edge sharper than usual. Her silver eyes darted between the distorted readings on her console. "Vren's ships are holding position near the gateway, but their formation, it's deliberate, almost like they're shielding something." "They're stalling," Elias muttered. "They want us to focus on their fleet while they finish whatever they've started." Lieutenant Michael glanced up from his station, his face pale under the erratic light. "Sir, if that thing opens, if it really is a gateway, we don't know what's coming through." "Then we make sure it doesn't," Elias replied. His voice cut through the tension, leaving no room for doubt. "Target their lead vessels. If we break their lines, we'll force Vren to reveal his hand." The ship's weapon systems powered up, a deep thrum reverberating through the decks. The bridge lights dimmed slightly as energy redirected to the cannons, the faint hum of readiness filling the air like the draw of a blade. Outside, the enemy fleet loomed, dark shapes moving against the nebula's unnatural glow, their outlines jagged and predatory. "Fire," Elias commanded. The Aegis unleashed a volley of precision missiles and kinetic rounds. The projectiles streaked through the void, their trails illuminating the chaotic space like falling stars. The lead enemy frigate exploded in a violent burst of light, debris scattering in all directions. The shockwave rippled across the enemy formation, and for a moment, their lines wavered. "They're retaliating!" Michael shouted as a barrage of plasma bolts rained down on the Aegis. The shields flared bright, absorbing the impact but sending vibrations shivering through the hull. The tang of overheated metal filled the bridge, sharp and acrid. Elias's voice was steady, unyielding. "Hold position. Liana, what's Vren's next move?" "He's waiting for something," she said, her fingers racing across her console. "Or someone. His fleet isn't engaging at full strength." Elias frowned, his instincts prickling. "He knows we're coming. He wants us alive." Before he could elaborate, a sudden alert blared across the bridge. Liana's screen flared red, data streaming faster than the eye could follow. Her breath hitched audibly. "Captain," she said, her voice low, "the singularity, it's stabilizing. They're actively feeding it energy." "What happens if it stabilizes?" Elias asked, though he already dreaded the answer. "It becomes a bridge," she replied, her tone grim, "to wherever it's connected." Elias's thoughts raced, every scenario turning darker. Vren wasn't just playing with fire. He was inviting the entire galaxy to burn. The realization hit him like a cold tide. Whatever was on the other side of that gateway, Vren believed it could reshape everything. "Target the energy relays," Elias ordered. "If we disrupt the stabilization process, we can shut it down." Liana hesitated. "That might destabilize the entire area. The gateway could collapse violently." "Better that than letting it open," Elias said, his voice firm. "Do it." The Aegis shifted course, its cannons locking onto the faint energy signatures emanating from Vren's fleet. The weapons roared to life, sending a focused barrage toward the glowing relays. The first relay shattered in a burst of fiery light, the energy surge briefly illuminating the twisted metal of nearby ships. "They're repositioning," Michael called out. "Their carriers are moving to intercept." Elias's mind worked like a machine, calculating risks and outcomes. He turned to Liana. "Can we divert power to the secondary batteries?" "Not without compromising shields," she said. Her voice was steady, but her gaze flickered with concern. "Then do it," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "We can't hold back now." The ship's auxiliary cannons came online, their smaller but faster projectiles cutting through the void. The Aegis maneuvered nimbly, evading enemy fire while maintaining its assault. The second energy relay exploded moments later, and the nebula seemed to shudder in response. Light twisted and fractured around the singularity, the once smooth glow now a jagged, pulsing scar in space. "They're panicking," Liana said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Their fleet's movements are erratic." "Captain, we're nearing their fleet," Liana Drell said, her tone carrying an edge sharper than usual. Her silver eyes darted between the distorted readings on her console. "Vren's ships are holding position near the gateway, but their formation, it's deliberate, almost like they're shielding something." "They're stalling," Elias muttered. "They want us to focus on their fleet while they finish whatever they've started." Lieutenant Michael glanced up from his station, his face pale under the erratic light. "Sir, if that thing opens, if it really is a gateway, we don't know what's coming through." "Then we make sure it doesn't," Elias replied. His voice cut through the tension, leaving no room for doubt. "Target their lead vessels. If we break their lines, we'll force Vren to reveal his hand." The ship's weapon systems powered up, a deep thrum reverberating through the decks. The bridge lights dimmed slightly as energy redirected to the cannons, the faint hum of readiness filling the air like the draw of a blade. Outside, the enemy fleet loomed, dark shapes moving against the nebula's unnatural glow, their outlines jagged and predatory. "Fire," Elias commanded. The Aegis unleashed a volley of precision missiles and kinetic rounds. The projectiles streaked through the void, their trails illuminating the chaotic space like falling stars. The lead enemy frigate exploded in a violent burst of light, debris scattering in all directions. The shockwave rippled across the enemy formation, and for a moment, their lines wavered. "They're retaliating!" Michael shouted as a barrage of plasma bolts rained down on the Aegis. The shields flared bright, absorbing the impact but sending vibrations shivering through the hull. The tang of overheated metal filled the bridge, sharp and acrid. Elias's voice was steady, unyielding. "Hold position. Liana, what's Vren's next move?" "He's waiting for something," she said, her fingers racing across her console. "Or someone. His fleet isn't engaging at full strength." Elias frowned, his instincts prickling. "He knows we're coming. He wants us alive." Before he could elaborate, a sudden alert blared across the bridge. Liana's screen flared red, data streaming faster than the eye could follow. Her breath hitched audibly. "Captain," she said, her voice low, "the singularity, it's stabilizing. They're actively feeding it energy." "What happens if it stabilizes?" Elias asked, though he already dreaded the answer. "It becomes a bridge," she replied, her tone grim, "to wherever it's connected." Elias's thoughts raced, every scenario turning darker. Vren wasn't just playing with fire. He was inviting the entire galaxy to burn. The realization hit him like a cold tide. Whatever was on the other side of that gateway, Vren believed it could reshape everything. "Target the energy relays," Elias ordered. "If we disrupt the stabilization process, we can shut it down." Liana hesitated. "That might destabilize the entire area. The gateway could collapse violently." "Better that than letting it open," Elias said, his voice firm. "Do it." The Aegis shifted course, its cannons locking onto the faint energy signatures emanating from Vren's fleet. The weapons roared to life, sending a focused barrage toward the glowing relays. The first relay shattered in a burst of fiery light, the energy surge briefly illuminating the twisted metal of nearby ships. "They're repositioning," Michael called out. "Their carriers are moving to intercept." Elias's mind worked like a machine, calculating risks and outcomes. He turned to Liana. Can we divert power to the secondary batteries? Not without compromising shields, she said. Her voice was steady, but her gaze flickered with concern. Then do it, Elias said, his tone leaving no room for debate. We can't hold back now. The ship's auxiliary cannons came online, their smaller but faster projectiles cutting through the void. The Aegis maneuvered nimbly, evading enemy fire while maintaining its assault. The second energy relay exploded moments later, and the nebula seemed to shudder in response. Light twisted and fractured around the singularity, the once smooth glow now a jagged, pulsing scar in space. They're panicking, Liana said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. Their fleet's movements are erratic. Good, Elias said. Let's keep them off balance. But just as the tide seemed to turn in their favor, the main screen flickered, and Vren's face appeared once again. His expression was calm, almost serene, but his eyes gleamed with dangerous purpose. Elias, Vren said, his voice smooth as silk, you're as predictable as ever. Always the righteous soldier, always trying to save the day. Elias stepped forward, his glare cutting through the screen. I'm not here to trade insults, Vren. Whatever you think you're doing, it ends now. Vren chuckled, the sound cold and hollow. You still don't see it, do you? This isn't about you or me. This is about breaking the cycle, about giving the galaxy something it's never had before. Freedom. Freedom? Elias shot back. You're opening a door to annihilation. Annihilation? Vren echoed, his tone almost mocking. No, Elias, evolution. You fear what you don't understand just like they do. That's why you'll never win. The screen went dark, and the Aegis shuddered violently. Liana's voice cut through the chaos. Massive energy spiked from the singularity. It's... The rest of her sentence was lost as the gateway flared to life. The light was blinding, searing through the nebula like a second sun. Shadows danced across the bridge, twisted and monstrous. The singularity had stabilized, its surface rippling like liquid fire. Elias's heart pounded as he stared into the impossible. Beyond the gateway, a dark shape loomed, a massive ancient construct that defied comprehension. Its surface pulsed faintly, as if alive, and its edges seemed to bend the fabric of space itself. "What the hell is that?" Michael whispered, his voice trembling. Liana's expression was grim. "It's not a weapon," she said. "It's something else, something older." Elias tore his gaze away, his mind racing. "Prepare all weapons. Whatever comes through that gateway, we stop it here." The Aegis pivoted, its cannons locking onto the gateway as the crew braced for what felt like an inevitable reckoning. In the distance, Vren's fleet began to move again, their formation tightening as if preparing for a final stand. Elias gripped the console, his knuckles white. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. The gateway wasn't just a doorway, it was a challenge, a test of everything humanity had fought to become. And as the first shadow began to emerge from the rippling light, Elias knew one thing for certain. The battle for the galaxy had only just begun. The shadow emerging from the gateway was an abomination of scale and design. Its surface shimmered with unnatural symmetry, each curve and angle defying logic, as if it had been constructed by something that didn't adhere to the physical rules of the galaxy. Pale blue light pulsed faintly across its body like veins carrying an otherworldly energy. It didn't move like a ship. It drifted, steady and deliberate, exuding menace with every silent inch it claimed. On the horizon's Aegis, the bridge was suffocatingly tense. Every crew member was locked in their stations, watching the tactical displays and the monstrous entity ahead. The air, sharp with the faint tang of scorched circuits from earlier damage, carried the weight of unspoken fear. Elias Rahine stood rigid, his arms crossed over his chest as his sharp eyes took in every detail of the creature machine that had emerged. Liana Drell's voice broke the silence, cold and analytical. "That thing, it's not Kolrith. It's not anything I've seen before." "Give me details," Elias said, his tone a blade's edge. Liana's fingers moved swiftly across her console. It's emitting radiation across multiple spectra, none of them stable. Its energy output is staggering. If it's a weapon, it's far beyond anything we've encountered. It's not just a weapon, Elias said, his voice low. It's a statement. Lieutenant Michael turned from his console, his brow furrowed. Sir, if we engage it head-on, I don't think we'll survive. We're not here to survive, Elias said, his voice hardening. We're here to win. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The ship's vibrations carried through the soles of their boots as the weapon systems calibrated, their low hum punctuating the tense quiet. Elias turned sharply to the holographic map, now dominated by the gateway and the hulking shape beyond. Listen closely, Elias began, his voice cutting through the room like steel on stone. Vren's banking on us doing one of two things. Either we throw everything we've got at that thing and fail, or we back off and let him finish whatever he started. We're not doing either. He gestured toward the tactical display. That thing is drawing power directly from the gateway. If we sever the link, we cripple it. Liana frowned. You're suggesting we destabilize the gateway? Elias nodded. Exactly. If we can overload its energy feeds, the feedback could collapse the entire structure. And take us with it, Michael said, his voice rising. Only if we're still here, Elias countered. This has to be surgical. We'll need a small strike team to plant disruption charges at key relay points. The Aegis will provide cover, but the rest will depend on precision and speed. He turned to Liana. Can you isolate those relay points? Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, her silver eyes narrowing as she scanned the data. Yes, there are 3 major energy conduits feeding into the gateway. Hit all 3, and the collapse will be inevitable. Elias nodded. Good. Michael, coordinate the strike team. I want only our best on this. And you? Michael asked, his tone cautious. I'll lead the team myself, Elias said without hesitation. The bridge fell silent. Liana turned to him, her expression unreadable. You're the captain. Your place is here. My place is where I can make the most difference, Elias replied. If this fails, none of us are getting out of here. I'm not asking anyone to take risks I wouldn't take myself. The crew accepted his words without argument. Elias moved toward the command console, his fingers brushing against the cold metal surface. Liana, you'll take command of the Aegis in my absence. Keep the enemy fleet occupied, but don't engage unless you're forced to. Our objective is the gateway. Liana inclined her head slightly. Understood. Elias turned to Michael. Prep the strike shuttle. We leave in 10 minutes. The shuttle's interior was cramped, the walls lined with panels that flickered faintly under the stress of the nebula's energy distortions. Elias stood at the front, gripping the rail above his head as the craft jolted forward. Beside him, the strike team checked their gear, rifles, explosives, and reinforced suits designed to withstand the Singularity's volatile energy fields. Specialist Aaron Vey, a sharp-eyed demolitions expert, was securing the charges when he glanced up. Captain, you ever wonder if we bite off more than we can chew? All the time, Elias replied without missing a beat. But I also know we don't stop chewing until it's done. The comment earned a few nervous chuckles, but the tension remained palpable. The shuttle's lights flickered as it breached the gateway's perimeter, the distortions outside growing more violent. Shadows danced across the walls, flickering in and out of sync with reality. Approaching target zone, the pilot called out, her voice calm despite the chaos outside. It's going to get rough. The shuttle lurched violently as it entered the gateway's core. The air inside felt heavier, as if the Singularity's gravity was reaching out to claim them. Elias steadied himself, his eyes fixed on the display at the front. The energy conduits were visible now, massive spires of twisting metal that pulsed with blue light, like arteries feeding the beast beyond. This is it, Elias said, his voice steady. Get ready. The shuttle landed with a jarring thud, its hatch hissing open to reveal a platform bathed in otherworldly light. The energy conduits loomed above, their surfaces alive with shifting patterns that seemed to ripple with intent. The air crackled faintly, filling the strike team's suits with static vibrations that prickled against their skin. "Move out," Elias ordered. The team advanced with precision, their boots clanging softly against the platform. Every step felt heavier, the gravity here pulling at them with unnatural force. As they neared the first conduit, Aaron knelt to plant the charge, his hands steady despite the oppressive atmosphere. "First charge set," he said, his voice crackling over the comm. "Good. Keep moving," Elias replied. The second conduit was farther, its base surrounded by jagged machinery that hissed with bursts of steam-like energy. As the team approached, a piercing screech erupted from above. Elias looked up to see a swarm of mechanical drones descending from the shadows, their sleek bodies reflecting the conduit's eerie light. "Defensive positions!" he barked. The team opened fire, their rifles spitting bursts of kinetic rounds that tore through the first wave of drones. The air was thick with the acrid tang of overheated metal as the drones exploded in rapid succession, their fragments raining down like molten hail. "Cover me!" Aaron shouted as he planted the second charge. Elias moved to provide cover, his rifle cutting down another drone as it dove toward them. The sound of battle filled his ears, sharp reports of gunfire, the screech of failing machines, and the low, ominous hum of the gateway's power. "Second charge set," Aaron called out. "Fall back to the third conduit," Elias ordered. The team regrouped and sprinted toward the final objective. The air around them seemed to twist and ripple, making every step feel like a battle against gravity itself. As they reached the third conduit, a deafening roar echoed from the gateway. Elias turned to see the shadow beyond it moving, closer now, its edges sharp and menacing. "Hurry!" he shouted. Aaron worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. The charge clicked into place, its red light blinking steadily. "All charges set," Aaron confirmed. Elias activated his comm. "Liana, we're ready. Detonate on my mark." Her voice came through calm and resolute. "Understood." Elias took a final glance at the shadow beyond the gateway. Whatever Vren had unleashed, it wasn't meant to exist here. He turned back to his team, his voice sharp. "Move! Now!" As they raced back to the shuttle, the platform beneath them began to tremble. The charges had started their countdown, and the singularity pulsed violently, its light flickering like a dying star. The shadow moved again, and Elias knew they were out of time. The platform beneath the strike team buckled, the rippling energy of the singularity tearing through its structure like a storm battering fragile glass. The charges were armed, their blinking lights synchronized with the countdown displayed on Elias Rain's wrist monitor. Every second felt drawn out, stretched by the oppressive pull of the gateway and the monstrous shadow shifting within. "Move!" Elias shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos as the team sprinted toward the shuttle. The air itself seemed alive, thick with electric tension and the faint metallic tang of the energy surges around them. Each breath burned, heavy and sharp in their suits as they pushed against the gravitational distortions. Behind them, the shadow grew larger, its edges now clearly defined, an amalgamation of shifting metal and flesh, its surface glistening with unnatural light. It moved with dreadful purpose, a silent harbinger of whatever waited beyond the gateway. "Captain, it's accelerating!" Liana's voice crackled through the comms. Her calm professionalism carried a sharp edge of urgency. "You have 30 seconds before detonation." Elias' jaw tightened. "Understood. Get the Aegis clear of the blast radius and prepare for retrieval." His boots hit the shuttle's ramp just as the structure above them groaned, a sound like bones snapping under immense weight. The rest of the team followed, breathless but alive, as Aaron Vey slapped the control panel to seal the hatch. "We're in!" Aaron yelled. "Get us the hell out of here!" The shuttle jolted forward, its thrusters straining against the gravitational pull. Elias grabbed a rail to steady himself, his gaze fixed on the viewport. The shadow's form loomed impossibly large now, its surfaces twisting and shifting in ways that made the eyes ache. It reached out, a massive tendril of shimmering darkness, stretching toward the escaping shuttle. "Pilot, evasive maneuvers!" Elias barked, his voice like a whip. The shuttle banked hard, throwing the crew sideways as the tendril missed by mere meters, its energy ripples scorching the air behind them. A deafening roar filled the cabin, not a sound, but a vibration that resonated deep in their bones, as though the shadow was screaming in rage. 10 seconds! Liana's voice came through, crisp and final. Elias braced himself against the bulkhead, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the heart of the singularity. Detonate! The charges exploded in perfect unison, their shockwaves rippling through the gateway's core. The light from the singularity faltered, its once blinding glow now sputtering like a dying flame. For a moment, everything held still, a fragile pause before the inevitable. Then the collapse began. The singularity imploded with a force that defied comprehension, its energy folding inward as space itself warped and twisted. The gateway's edges fractured, massive shards of glowing metal breaking apart and tumbling into the void. The shadow let out one final ear-piercing screech before it was consumed, dragged back into the collapsing abyss. The shockwave hit the shuttle moments later, slamming it forward like a leaf in a hurricane. Sparks erupted from the control panels as alarms blared, the air thick with the acrid bite of burning circuits. The pilot wrestled with the controls, her knuckles white as she fought to stabilize the craft. "We're losing power to the aft thrusters," she yelled. "Keep us steady," Elias shouted back, his voice carrying the weight of command. "We just need to clear the blast radius." The shuttle shuddered violently, but it held together, breaking free of the nebula's chaotic edges, just as the horizon's aegis came into view. The larger ship's silhouette was a beacon in the darkness, its docking bay open and waiting. "Aegis, this is Rain," Elias said through the comm. "We're coming in hot. Brace for impact." Liana's voice came through, steady despite the tension. "Understood. Bay crew is ready." The shuttle lurched one final time as it entered the docking bay, its landing skids screeching against the deck. The team staggered out, breathless and battered, but alive. Elias was the last to leave, his boots striking the deck with purpose as he strode toward the command console. "Status report," he demanded. Liana turned from her station, her gaze sharp. "The gateway is gone. Collapse was total. The Kolrith fleet is retreating, and whatever Vren was trying to bring through, it's not coming back." Elias exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly as the weight of the mission began to lift. But relief was tempered by the memory of Vren's final words. This wasn't over. "Scan the area for any remaining anomalies," he ordered, "and keep the fleet on high alert." The bridge crew moved quickly, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten as they carried out his commands. Liana stepped closer, her voice low enough that only Elias could hear. "Do you think he's dead?" she asked. Elias didn't answer immediately. His mind replayed the last moments of the battle, the shadow, and Vren's smug certainty. Finally, he shook his head. "Men like Vren don't die easily," he said. "But if he survived, he's wounded. And he knows what we're capable of now." Liana nodded, her expression unreadable. "And the rest of the galaxy?" Elias turned to the viewport where the nebula's chaotic light had dimmed, leaving only the vast emptiness of space. "They'll know too," he said, his voice firm. "They've underestimated us for too long. That ends today." The weight of his words settled over the bridge like a solemn oath. The crew exchanged glances, their exhaustion replaced by a quiet resolve. Humanity had been pushed to the edge, mocked and dismissed by the galaxy's great powers, but they had survived. They had fought back, and they had won. As the horizon's aegis set course for safer territory, Elias allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The cost of their victory was immense. Lives lost, resources spent, and a fragile peace shattered. But it was a price worth paying, because no species, no empire, and no force in the galaxy would ever forget the day humanity snapped. The stars outside burned bright and unyielding, a reminder of the infinite challenges ahead. But for the first time, Elias saw them not as obstacles, but as opportunities. Humanity had proven its worth, and now the galaxy would have no choice but to reckon with it.